People said humanity split clean in two, those who dove into 18-plus adult games and those who didn't, and yeah, he'd heard that same claim before. The first group, those who couldn't resist adult games, got hooked on figures like her, a total showstopper from the game Last Arcana. The one, though, used to be part of the latter crew once, until his path slammed into Last Arcana. Last Arcanum didn't just look like a game, it hid a whole world of danger underneath the surface. He finally clocked it. Last Arcanum wasn't just an adult game. Everyone online basically agrees Last Arcanum is a full-on RPG, and even with all the non-erotic stuff going hard, it still grabs you way more than most other games, while the erotic bits is an extra cherry on top. He rolled up on Last Arcanum now not as some casual adult game, but like a man chasing something sacred, having changed his class and become a full-on admirer of what it truly offers. He still remembered the time he nearly skipped the erotic cutscenes, thinking they were just filler, but now he was carefully collecting pictures of Iris John, and that totally proved his taste ran deeper than he thought. He felt it was a slap in the face to the creators, so he refused to skip a single slice of Last Arcana. He had to savor every corner. Even with that conviction burning in his chest, he still caught himself thinking, should I just skip it? The next event with Scamalto's. Scamalto's aka Altos Randall looked like instant trouble, and he even strutted around boasting that he was the real son of a duke's family, all while chuckling to himself like he'd uncovered some secret. At the Magic Academy, Scamaltos reveled in tormenting handsome protagonists, throwing them into one harassment after another like it was sport, pure, villainous mid-boss energy. That lowlife got off on wrecking the heroines with brutal trauma, and even Sieg, the clean, fan favorite with the physique players adore, still got hit hard, shattered to tears, and left apologizing through the pain. The gamer's face twisted in pure disgust and rage as he spat curses at the character, screaming that Scamaltos was driving him insane, especially with Iris John, the one he swore he loved, and then he shut it down, deciding to skip the event and push himself into the next segment. Scamaltos was insanely famous, but not for anything good. Everyone painted him as a pig, and the disrespect never stopped. In the last arcane fanfic craze, the hunky hero always obliterated Scamaltos with ruthless flair to finally heal the heroine's trauma, and even the game's own production team made it painfully clear in an interview that they weren't forgiving Scamaltos at all. The second Scamaltos popped up during the live broadcast, the screen exploded with furious comments, players screaming they hate him, demanding justice for Raylachin, and roasting how the hell a character that awful even got put in the story. Late in the main route, Scamaltos got ripped apart, impaled by a storm of blades, screaming through shock and agony, fighting to understand why this nightmare was happening to him. Altos Randall wasn't just defeated, his in-game end was final, stamped into the world by a tombstone with his name, and even Scamaltos' vicious behavior couldn't save him from the game's mastermind sealing his fate for good. While other mid-bosses might get a twist like reconciliation scenes or branching battle routes, Scamalto got nothing, because his relentless, aggravating antics had basically guaranteed he'd go down for good. Still soaking in the game's lore, the gamer started getting this dull, pounding ache behind his eyes. He stood in his room, fidgeting with his tie, and a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion crashed over him. He had to sleep soon after pushing through the final stretch of his 24th run, or maybe it was his 5th, because in that tired haze the number had slipped away. His head pounded as he stretched shirtless, aching for nothing but Last Arcanum, and even after countless runs, he still hadn't cracked the true ending or cleared the one route that leads through Scamaltos. He started slipping into his pajamas, still replaying how brutal the road to the true ending was, one that demanded every last achievement. Then, with only 2 hours left before work, he went for a quick nap and face-planted onto his bed. Even while he slept, one thought wouldn't let go. He had to finish the Scamalto route, because he knew without it, he'd never 100% the game. Right as his eyes started to shut and sleep pulled him under, a wild dream detonated. There he was, dressed sharp, standing with 3 gorgeous heroines with Iris John, a charming witch, right in the mix, plus one more sweet woman. And his heart begged to be the main character, to live a happily ever after with them, even to the point of wishing he could be reincarnated straight into the world of Last Arcanum. Then, wham, a weird noise sliced through the dream. In the dream, his thirst for justice exploded into action when he suddenly slammed into Scamaltos and drove a brutal kick into him, making the villain stumble back while the gamer's chest swelled with savage satisfaction, thinking just how much fun it'd be to beat that despicable creep for good. Dream shattered to pieces, and all that remained was the breathtaking sight of a perfectly detailed, coffered ceiling. He stood in a lavish room, looking different than before. His dark hair had somehow lightened, and confusion hit him hard as he stared at the glittering place because the whole interior felt weirdly familiar, like he'd seen it before. He took one look around and instantly knew this was straight from Last Arcanum Asterisk, but he couldn't lock down where in the world he was. He shoved the idea aside fast. No way was he stressing over his PC's contents before reincarnation, not now. He had to rein it in because the last thing he wanted was for them to sniff out that he was secretly a man of culture. He knew the game inside out. He'd nearly snagged every achievement, and he figured surviving would be a cakewalk until he realized he didn't just start over, he got reincarnated into the world of Asterisk Last Arcanum. Anik could wait right now. He had to figure out exactly what was going on around him. He stared at his brand new body, trying to guess which game character he'd somehow been reborn as, and he swore a mirror had to be close by, something to prove who he really was. He spotted a huge, fancy mirror, crept up on it, and yanked back the curtain. Then his reflection snapped into view. A chubby-faced young guy with light, wavy hair and a ruffled shirt, staring right back like it knew him. The sight slammed into him like a nightmare. He ripped out a scream, and a pale, ghostly version of his past self flashed beside him, glasses and dark hair, screaming too, and somehow he knew it was him. "I'm scum." His horrified realization thundered through the grand estate. One desperate word tore free from his lips: Altos. A shrill scream ripped through the air, jolting the maid so hard she dropped her tray, dishes clattered, and porcelain exploded across the floor. The second maid, short brown hair, totally unbothered, stopped Riella's frantic apologies in their tracks and told her that this kind of chaos was almost normal whenever Ultisama was around, though she admitted she was still shocked by how loud the earlier commotion got. The senior snapped, told Riella to clear the mess since he'd take care of it, then ordered her to check on the young master. Riella was still flustered, but she swallowed her nerves and meekly agreed. The gamer, trapped inside Scamolto's body, whipped his eyes to his reflection and froze in disbelief. He really pulled off reincarnation into Last Arcanum, and the shock of his new life hit like a truck. It's over. Panic surged through him as fate slapped him with a brutal twist. Of all people, he got stuck being Scamolto, the one everyone was meant to hate, forced to squirm, and then doomed to die. Panic surged through him. No, this had to be wrong. There was no way he was Scamalto's, not after everything he'd felt. Why couldn't he have been the protagonist, Sieg, instead? As he kept locking eyes with his reflection, one tiny detail snapped his focus, because the face staring back was Scamolto's, and it was younger. He noticed this Scamalto's was way younger than the one in the game, maybe only 10, and that tiny detail lit a spark of hope in his chest. If Scamalto's was only at that age when he started slipping into arrogance, there was still a chance to dodge the bad ending. He remembered the lore. Ultos, a magic prodigy, started acting untouchable at just 12, then spiraled into pure self-indulgence, ditching both his spell studies and his sword training. According to the official settings, Altos got swept up in his infatuation for women, chasing them relentlessly, while one maid scrambled to stop him and another woman broke down in tears behind them. After burning through a wrecked life, he finally morphed into the full-blown Scamoltos the gamer knew and absolutely hated. A wild new plan sparked in his head. If he went full opposite of what Scamaltos had done, maybe he could dodge the death that was already written for him. He swore off chasing women, kept his studying steady, and trained like he meant it, because the real goal was simple: stay as far from the protagonist's party as possible. He froze on the spot, totally hooked by the maid's gorgeous look, thinking, did beauty like this really exist in the game? And yeah, she was undeniably cute. Moments later, Riella the maid crept up to him like she was afraid of the answer, asking if he was troubled, then admitted she'd heard his scream and figured it was just another one of his tantrums. He flinched inside at her words, finally clocking what his usual tantrums really meant, and then the truth hit him hard. As Scamolto's, this time his situation wasn't just bad, it was dire. His eyes wouldn't let go of her, especially that bold, heart-shaped emblem on her chest, glowing like it was beating with her very presence. Riella kept staring, and her flustered defenses snapped up. She crossed her arms fast, while a hot blush crept across his face too, and his inner game watched the awkward moment with a smug, knowing grin. Riella started blurting out apologies nonstop, her head hanging low in pure shame, while he finally snapped and recognized her from the game's lore, Scamolto's attendant maid, a character who'd only ever shown up in flashbacks. He tried to drag her name out of his mind, and then, bam, a faint memory flickered to life till his head snapped in realization. That's right, Rihanna. Still, Riella kept firing off a flood of apologies, so quiet it was almost swallowed by the air. Then he snapped, trying to cut in, Riella, what are you apologizing for over and over? His attempt to calm her only made it worse. She snapped into tears, blurted out that she was sorry for talking back, and sobbed out, no, my name is Rihanna, it's Riella. Then, shaking with distress, she added, I'll be Rihanna from now on. He just froze, totally thrown off by her wild outburst and the fact her story kept contradicting itself. What are you even talking about? I called you Rila. And then the cruel truth hit him hard that this whole situation was nowhere near good. Iris-chan was in full-blown panic, blurting sorry again and again to Scamolto, who just stood there with arms crossed, glaring like her freakout was ridiculous, like she'd practically collided with him, right down to the tiny owl he let out. The male gamer stared at the chaos and wondered if Iris-chan's fear could really be that intense, while Scamolto stood there, totally stunned by her non-stop panicked apologies. The male gamer suddenly got hit with the awful truth. If this kept going, Scamolto's would be branded as the villain for good, and he swore at the chaos unfolding in real time. Iris-chan kept pouring out apology after apology, bowing so deep and so often that it only shoved Scamolto's panic even harder, so he begged her to stop, terrified her non-stop remorse would lock in his reputation as the villain. She blurted out her apologies and admitted she just preferred the masculine pronoun, or maybe she tried to joke that her whole explanation didn't even make sense. Scamolto started out totally lost, then snapped and finally got her odd little habit. Watching this weird little exchange, the male gamer couldn't help but feel like it was right out of Riella's backstory from the game's own lore. Riella's official Last Arcadia debut drops a brutal truth. She's the super loyal maid to Scamolto's until his selfishness turns her devotion into a weapon against her, breaking her right hand and getting her tossed aside with zero explanation. The mansion staff quickly sour on her too because Scamolto's unilaterally shoves her out even though she'd been grinding since she was young, just so she could never fix his personality. The story pressed on and Scamolto's didn't just brush off the maid who'd served him since childhood. He tossed her away with cold, cruel indifference, pushing himself farther from everyone in the mansion and burning every chance he had to become better. The male gamer was convinced Riella was the key to Scamolto's whole tale. Then he remembered how that devastating backstory hit the official site as a short story, igniting an uproar so loud players demanded a route where the maid, crushed and fired because Scamolto chased his own happiness, could finally get her own. Iris-chan looked wrecked, tears spilling as if they'd been waiting all along, while the male gamer muttered to himself that only real monsters would fire or scare an attendant maid on purpose. Then Scamolto just flashed that sweet, harmless smile and said, like it was the obvious move, that the first thing they had to do was calm her down. With a grin so unsettling it made your skin crawl, she cornered Riella and demanded to know why she looked so terrified. Then Riella's eyes brimmed with tears and pure fear took over her face. Still shaken to the core, Riella dropped to her knees and told her young master her panic wasn't random. It was all because she screwed up the daily routine the day before and dragged trouble right to him. Meanwhile, the male gamer froze in total confusion, staring at the mystery like, what even is this all supposed to mean? He sat there, mulling over whether this was just the basic act of feeding a baby, and the image of a maid doing it flashed in his mind. Then he wondered if the awe he knew was totally different from what Riella meant, because Riella, red-faced and flustered, turned to him and demanded why he was even asking about something like that. Riella clapped a hand over her mouth in shock and blurted that he'd cooked up yet another new game, because the whole thing felt downright awful. Then she started laying it all out, 48 different kinds of awe, each one picked out by the young master, like the one where he'd sit on her lap, staring at each other face to face, and another where they were seated back to back. Riella kept talking, laying out exactly what she meant, a lap pillow with a cover, right there on the couch, then feeding him while she stood behind him, before she nervously asked, do you still want to hear more? Scamolto's and the male gamer both snapped into total shock as Riella kept escalating her way too explicit descriptions, especially when she brought up a lap pillow with the cover off. Riella then slid into that exact lap pillow, eyes wide as she wrapped the moment in a cover, feeding Scamolto's while he sprawled content on her lap, and she confirmed the male gamer's unsettling grasp of what was really happening. The male gamer stared on, visibly shaken to the core, while Scamolto, still sprawled on Riella's lap, looked perfectly blissed out, utterly clueless about the mess his actions were about to cause. He kept staring at the nightmare of what it really meant, his head spinning with awe that suddenly felt terrifying. Riella saw the panic on his face and hurried to reassure him, saying she was okay and only felt a bit dizzy. Even as Riella spoke, her heart didn't buy it. She worried sick that Scamaltos would drag a gorgeous woman into filthy acts, and yeah, she couldn't deny it. Her own beauty was part of what got her noticed. A sudden flashback lit up the scene. Scamolto's eyes shut tight in bliss, while Riella crouched beside him, feeding him a sweet treat and whispering in awestruck wonder. Back in the present, the male gamer couldn't shake what this all meant, so he grilled Riella on the spot, straight up asking if her agreeing meant she'd actually perform the awe if he ordered it. His blunt question snapped Riella into a flinch, her face twisting with raw, crushing distress, while he looked completely flustered, unsure what to do next. He jerked back in a hurry, panic flooding his thoughts, and the moment he imagined playing the villain, he saw a brutal, bleak future instantly, so he slammed that idea shut. His mind kept racing in circles, the weight of this moment crushing him as he measured the real price of these demands, your life, traded away like it's nothing, and he shut that idea down hard. Then he snapped his gaze to Riella, begging her to confirm it. How could something this overwhelming be normal in this world? Even for a dog, he was praying it wasn't true. With fresh grit, he snapped that Riella didn't have to perform the awe anymore. Her eyes flew wide, terror hit her, and she stammered, "Are you firing me?" Because she'd been warned she'd be dismissed if she didn't do it every single day. While Riella talked, he clocked the bruise on her injured hand, and he snapped back to his position, promising her, no matter what, he wouldn't force her into anything like that, not with her hurt. He told her he didn't just guess asterisk, he knew about her injured hand because the official records made it clear, and Riella's eyes widened as she demanded to know how he'd found out. Her eyes bulged with shock, and a hot blush rushed across her cheeks as her brain caught up to what he just said. Then he swore he'd report it to the head, telling everyone Riella wasn't well and ordering her to drop everything and rest right now. He figured she'd been hiding that injury, terrified she'd get fired, like this brutal condition could only come from Alto's relentless personality. With a dramatic flourish, he urged her to heal fast, reminding her she was his only maid. Then Riella stared back and whispered his title so softly it felt like a promise. As he strode away, the weight hit him. His casual attitude had made him miss what was truly right, and the more he thought, the more he realized he was handling it better than Scamalto himself. Suddenly, it hit him like a lightning bolt. He berated himself for being a total jerk, yelling that what he'd done was horribly wrong. Riella was still out there, and the panic in his chest drove him to sprint back toward her, shouting her name with pure, aching concern. He sank into a deep bow, regret blazing from every inch of him, and apologized over and over for messing up her name earlier. He swore he'd never repeat the mistake, then pleaded, heart and all, for her forgiveness. Riella stared at him, utterly stunned, unable to get a word out. Riella stared him down and called him by his title again, and he kept rattling out his apology, burning with embarrassment for trying to hide his mistake and for acting so thoughtlessly. From down below, Riella leaned in and steadied him, saying life doesn't let anyone get through without messing up, none of us. Then she praised Altasama for standing tall even when failure hits and admitted that she'd slipped too, even shattering a beloved play. Riella's reassurance sent the male gamer spiraling into deep thought, and worry etched itself across his furrowed brow. She kept smiling like nothing could shake her, clinging to her belief in Altasama after everything that just happened, swearing he was the truly splendid kind of person. Altasama's eyes shimmered. He wiped the tear from his face, thanked her, and begged her to keep leaning on him from here on out. Riella didn't hesitate. She swore that Altasama was her only master, and even though she was that amazing, it felt wrong that she wouldn't step into the main story. Right after that exchange, the male gamer, now fully wearing Scamoltos' skin, strode alone down a towering hallway, grinding on the thought that for Scum to climb into the mob, that first hurdle was finally cleared. And bam, out of nowhere, the head maid, stern as ever, stepped in with a stunned look on her face. She snapped in front of him right away, alarm blazing in her voice, demanding to know why the young master was out alone, and why he wasn't holding a woman's hand. Scamaltos shoved her out of his mind and launched into a brutal workout, grunting through push-ups and counting every single rep like it mattered. He went dead serious, paused for a beat, and declared that his next move would be zeroing in on magic, specifically body enhancement. That body enhancement was the very first magic Last Arcanum taught, and yeah, it made training way easier, but it also guaranteed your magic level would climb fast in the beginning. Scamaltos, a noble from Last Arcanum, carried a laugh-out-loud mountain of magical power, so vast it matched his royal bloodline, and it let him skyrocket his magic to completely ridiculous heights. Even with all that crushing power, he still couldn't shake the fact that, in the game, it was always chained to the ugliest, most brutal deeds. Arms locked across his chest, he listened as the head maid told him Riella would be back tomorrow, and she bowed with a proper apology for barging in on him. Relief hit him like a wave, and he blurted out, asking if her hand had fully healed yet. The head maid turned away just a little, her face giving nothing away, like she was confirming, quietly, that his sudden seriousness wasn't some joke at all, and he just stood there, staring, clearly thrown off. She squared up to him and said bluntly that his sudden change in attitude made her think he was up to his old games, messing with the servants like he used to. He looked totally stunned by how blunt she was, and she kept going, saying that digging up his past behavior felt downright unsettling. Moments later, the head maid stood there stunned and alone, staring at the young master's jaw-dropping transformation. Now she had the terrifying job of breaking it to every last staff member in the household. Then he broke down noblesse oblige like it was gospel, meaning if you've got power and influence, you don't stay selfish. You step up and use that status to help people, and he demanded her confirmation. Her stubborn silence made his nerves snap, and he pushed her to talk, his voice leaking impatience. She finally nodded, confirming he'd nailed it. His interpretation was spot on, and told him she'd pass his new intentions to everyone in the household, while he trusted her completely. With a sly smile, she said the young master was exactly what she'd always figured, and that left him staring at her, utterly confused. After laying out his new intentions to the head maid, Scamolto tipped his glasses up with a sly, knowing grin, then quietly reveled in it, because his whole master plan to fool them had landed perfectly. Even as he basked in his win, the old version of himself, back when he was just that male gamer, flashed through his mind, and he started mulling over noblesse oblige, the rule he'd only just acted on. Staring at the mansion's grand front, he kept thinking this wasn't about excuses, it was about cutting down the damage from his old, scummy moves, and he even renamed it in his head like, so it's basically scumless obligation, right? A young man sprawled in his lavish bed, yawned like a sleepy king, and let a little strand of drool escape as he greeted the brand new day. Then he stepped outside and froze because half a year had already slipped by since his reincarnation into last arc, and somehow he'd gotten used to this world, but he still needed a beat to truly sink in what was happening to him. He suddenly realized he wasn't some random nobody, he was Ultos Randall, aka Scamultos, and that meant he was the villain everyone in this world feared. As he slammed through his brutal push-up routine, he couldn't stop replaying his old days as a player who had absolutely hated Scamaltos. Then a wild idea hit him. What if Scamaltos had never even existed? Would Last Arc really have turned into the masterpiece everyone worships? Suddenly, he pictured that bloated Scamaltos seated on a throne, flanked by two irresistible women fawning over him. He studied how light crushes darkness and throws shadows even deeper, and that's exactly how Scamolto worked, lurking from the shadows as the real heart of the story, silently shaping the hero's whole journey. Then he couldn't stop wondering, was Scamalto the real main character after all? In his head, a beautiful boy crammed with unstoppable magic faced a tragic end, and he snapped at himself to calm down, wrestling his mind through these brutal, conflicting thoughts. The vision flared to life, and there, Scamoltos, wearing the Duke's heir, grinned with glowing eyes as he savored control over a shaking woman. He erupted in a manic laugh, swearing it only made everything more thrilling, while she begged for forgiveness and dragged her fiancé into the plea. Watching the whole mental projection, the young man recoiled. Scamoltos was utterly despicable. He snapped his head up, realizing his thoughts had dragged him off course, and now he had to lock back in and figure out what was right in front of him. He clutched the bamboo sword so hard his knuckles ached, face set in stone as Scamaltos's brutal fate came roaring back from the original story. No matter the route, it always ended the same. Stabbing, poison, strangulation, beheading. And then it hit him, cold and terrifying. If he kept walking this road, he'd get the same horrifying end. The thought of that ending hit like a brick. Then he flashed back to kendo days, gripping a bamboo sword and swinging with sheer fire, and for a second he felt thankful he'd joined the kendo club, even if he quit way too fast. He kept pounding through his swings without pause, admitting that even though he'd dabbled in kendo, a bamboo sword was nothing like the real blade. He worried that his club-level kendo wouldn't matter much here, especially since every sword around him looked nothing like the curved ones he trained with, and decided his first move had to be building raw basics before he even tried to learn the techniques of this world. With a stubborn set to his jaw, he shut his eyes and swore no matter how he got back into the world, even with his soul reborn into his beloved last arc, he would not let some cruel fate cut him down. A wild spark flared in his eyes the second he realized it. He had the upper hand because he'd mastered every inch of the original game and absorbed all that knowledge. In a fancy room with the lights still humming, he announced his brand new mission. He'd weaponize his game know-how like a cheat code, carving out a peaceful life while trying to fade into the world as nothing more than a background mob, and he even pointed straight to body enhancement as the key. As he learned from Hourglass, he realized no mob could stay helpless when crisis hits, so he knew he had to crank up both his strength and his magic fast. Decked out in something far more formal, he planted his feet, laid out his plan, and kept pumping his body enhancements, because this was the fastest way to level magic, and he vowed to push that boosted state to its absolute breaking point. He clutched an hourglass and watched his body boost tick down in real time, because with no status screen to tell him anything, he turned to the one thing he could measure: time, setting his first test to last exactly 3 minutes. When he looked up, he finally saw the real jaw-dropper. Magic was leaking out of his body nonstop, plain as day, and that meant keeping his body enhancement up was brutally harder than the game ever made it look. Magic kept spilling out, warping the air around him in plain sight, and the panic hit. Was this kind of runaway power actually dangerous, unlike the game where he'd never even worry about it? He remembered what the game taught him: body enhancement didn't just boost him, it forced magic to seep out of his whole body, and the flood of overflowing magic told him exactly how powerful he was. 2 minutes ticked by. He tried to clamp down on the magic leakage, but the moment he did, the body enhancement shredded and fell apart early, and he realized one brutal truth. Skill's magic leakage couldn't be controlled at all. He remembered the game's truth: Alto's noble blood and all carried an absurd ocean of magic, and once he kicked on body enhancement, it spilled out like a broken dam, flooding the area so everyone saw him as impossibly over-the-top strong. He finally understood this: if a good family kid like him tried to stay hidden while using that skill, his real power would get exposed the moment he let it loose. He fixed his eyes ahead, and a grim truth hit like a punch: body enhancement could only be used to level up, not to break the game, so if he wanted to stay a nobody mob, he had to blend in and never stand out. And man, it crushed him. Pouring his reincarnation into last art, trying to become overpowered with body enhancement would be a total waste. He wiped the sweat off his brow. 18 minutes had already slammed by, and even with every ounce of effort, he still pulled off a brand new record for keeping the enhancements running. Right out of nowhere, Riello the maid burst in and startled him, and then she beamed, cheerfully congratulating him on smashing his brand new record. Riella popped up out of nowhere and he froze. How had she gotten there? She just smiled and told him she'd been there the whole time, watching while he stayed completely oblivious. He admitted he messed up, blaming it on how locked in he'd been with training, then swore he'd be way more careful from here on out, while Riella just smiled, soft and unbothered. Even after that earlier slip, he couldn't stop himself from staring at Riella. Her smile was stunning and totally adorable, until she stepped in and said she'd just wrapped up her cleaning duties and was ready to help. Riella looked like she was in her mid-teens, but her body absolutely didn't match, so it made you stop and wonder what kind of choices went into designing her. She watched her master, eyes locked on his troubled face, and softly asked, if it's all right with you, should she bring Riella into the conversation? But he recoiled at the thought, because the idea of living with a too-alluring personal maid felt like refined torture, and he was terrified that one wrong moment would blow up in his face. He shot her a look, murmuring her name like it mattered, and she lit up with a bright smile. She could feel his distress and proved his secret thought right. She was a good girl. Scamolto stared at his past self and snapped at him to own what he'd done, because he'd bullied that sweet, innocent person over and over with zero mercy. She watched him, eyes wide with pure innocence, then a faint confusion crept in as if she could feel the storm of his inner fight. Moments later, they set out a dainty tea service on a little table, and just like that, it was clear the talk was about to turn serious and formal. He leaned in and told Riella his biggest worry: when you pump body enhancement, that huge surge of magic power spills out, and since he had more than everyone else, he couldn't risk it drawing attention. She totally misread what he meant, thinking he just didn't feel like flexing his power, then watched him hesitate before finally conceding that, sure, you could say that's the vibe, even if it wasn't the real meaning. He clocked her misunderstanding right away. She took his worry as good news, but it was the exact opposite. And then it hit him how brutal the magical power drain really was, because the loss was way bigger and more wasteful than he'd first believed. He found her cute and soothing, but he couldn't ignore the truth. Just asking Riella wouldn't fix the real problem haunting him. She hums softly and stays clueless about what's really going on, and that thought unsettles him. Troubling as it was, he still brooded over how clunky body enhancement felt, and then Maid Riella snapped out loud, eyes wide, like a shocking idea just hit her. She admitted that when she tried juggling a bunch of tasks, she'd mess up non-stop, smashing dishes left and right, until the head maid told her to slow down and focus on one thing at a time, and suddenly her disasters dropped way down. He couldn't help wondering if she was just clumsy at heart. Riella leaned in and tossed out what she jokingly called an amateur idea, asking straight up if pooling magical power into one spot or something like it could seriously backfire. Her suggestion lingered like a dare, amplified by the sharp heart-shaped cutout on her uniform. The idea of packing all that power into one place hit him like a thunderclap, and his eyes snapped wide with instant realization. He spun toward her and demanded, "Say it again, I'm listening. Concentrate the magical power in one spot, right?" Riella blinked, still unsure, then just answered, "Master." He weighed her idea, grinned because it wasn't bad at all, and realized it could supercharge the way magical power worked, so he jumped straight into testing it right away. With a fierce stare, he locked in his will and unleashed a brand new technique, pumping up his body and honing his focus to a razor edge. Energy exploded from his open palm, crackling with raw, unstoppable power. He stared at his hand, stunned, then a triumphant cry burst out of him. "Oh, I did it." He thrust out his hand and felt that weird, hard weight where the magic had just surged, then it disappeared in the next heartbeat. Riella stared, baffled, and the truth hit him. This partial enhancement magic left no trace, and it didn't exist in the original work at all, and that meant something terrifying was cooking, fast, and somehow exhilarating. She demanded to know why she couldn't see a single trace of magic, and he snapped back that he'd only pulled off a partial enhancement. Then he froze in disbelief when the enhanced part refused to bleed power at all, leaving it almost totally invisible. He couldn't stop thinking about how insane this magic was. This power didn't play by the game's rules at all, and nobody else in the cast could touch it. A sharp flicker of caution hit him. He couldn't be sure he was the only one using it, so he decided to move forward with extreme care. Later, he slid into the seat across from Maid Riella, bowed his head, and told her how grateful he was. Because of her simple idea, he could finally boost his body without risking the secret getting out, even if turning it into something truly useful would still be one brutal climb. She lit up with pure joy, practically bragging that she could finally help her master. Then his face hardened. He demanded she keep the partial enhancement a total secret, warning that if word ever spread, he'd lose the one advantage he couldn't afford to give up. Riella's eyes widened as she blurted, "So this secret is ours alone." He paused just long enough to feel the pressure, then nodded, confirming she had it right. Her cheeks flared crimson and her eyes popped wide, shock crashing in with a deep, aching emotion at the thought of their shared secret. A few weeks later, the skyline towered beneath a rising sun, and you could almost feel the days ticking after that wild discovery of the unique enhancement technique. During this stretch, he drilled nonstop, tightening his grip on that partial enhancement, then blasted swings, slid across the ground, and sprinted with this brand new, razor-subtle power. All those hard days finally paid off. Now he confidently showed off body enhancement, partial concentration, then reached out with a sharp, focused stare as if he'd done it 100 times. And yeah, like Scamolto always promised, week after week of practice was paying dividends, because he was getting damn good at concentrating his magical power. Riella stared him down like a hawk, but she still couldn't figure out which hand he was powering up, even when she watched every move up close. She finally realized the trick was totally undetectable, which meant in the middle of a fight, there was almost no way to spot it in time. He proved his mastery, saying that his body enhancement and focus cost a ridiculously tiny amount of magic, so he could keep it running for hours anytime he wanted. Even with all that efficiency, he couldn't help thinking, inside the world of Last Arcanum *, the copies weren't exact. In the original game, you couldn't mask magical power at all, but here, he could hide it. Then he spun around to Riella and demanded, "Was that partial enhancement your idea?" and she beamed, proudly confirming it, while he admitted he'd never heard of anyone else who could pull off something like that. With all the fallout to consider, he finally realized it. Riella's technique wasn't some real breakthrough at all, but a cheating skill, a power that didn't belong in the normal world. Riella's eyes popped wide with shock, instantly wondering if this really was a legit cheat skill. He admitted he couldn't be 100% sure, but he strongly suspected it, especially since Altos was only a powerhouse in the early game, meaning this brand new ability probably flipped everything and turbocharged his potential. He weighed the fallout of his new technique, knowing the later game's main characters would eventually blow past him, turning into straight-up cheat-level monsters, so right now he'd look pretty outmatched, but this move felt like it could flip the whole story. Riella swooped in and asked if he'd thought about trying a new game, practically vibrating with excitement as she offered to team up and play with him, only for him to freeze, staring at the idea as he wondered whether this mid-game move could truly pay off in the late game, or if it would crash and burn instantly. He dubbed the technique mob-style body enhancement, because saying it any other way felt clunky, and both he and Maid Riella broke into delighted chuckles at the idea. Grand Duke Randall's mansion loomed grandly beneath a clear sky, its countless windows blazing with reflected light. Inside the room, Altos Randall clenched his arms and felt something heavy stirring in his chest. He was torn, staring at a huge decision and trying to figure out the next move. While Riella fretted over his silence, the maid suddenly slid up with a tray, teapot steaming, and a cup waiting, then asked if he'd run into trouble again, offering him tea as if it could calm whatever haunted him. He told her he'd forged his basic strength and was ready to start learning swordsmanship, then leaned in for her advice: should he train under the knights or hire the mercenaries? When he mentioned mercenaries, she snapped into visible shock, eyes blazing wide with surprise, and he instantly clocked the panic and pressed her, asking why she freaked out so suddenly. Then she leaned in and told him straight up that as the Duke's heir he'd be way better off training with the Randall Knights because most of them were noble-born sons, loyal to the bone, polished to the last detail. He replayed her words in his head, weighing what it would mean to train with the Knights, while the info he dug up from the head revealed one brutal truth about Duke Randall's Altos household. He ran two separate forces, the Knights and the Mercenaries. These Knights ran like a full-on police or military operation, battle-hardened pros on the front line, ready to fight anyone who threatened Duke Randall, keeping the whole territory locked down and safe. Meanwhile, the mercenaries weren't just random killers, they were battle-tested adventurers, packed with hard-earned combat experience and every kind of fighting style, and they were the ones sent to crush the monsters that slipped into the territory. He kept wrestling with his training choices, then decided survival skills meant mercenaries were the move, until Riella snapped back hard, saying that for a young master, knights were the only option. Concern tightened across her brow, and a fresh bead of sweat slid down her temple as she battled with the fact that his stubbornness wouldn't budge. Even with worry clawing at her, he stood up with steel in his face and snapped, "All right, let's go." She watched him move, and a terrifying question sparked in her head: did he forget? Moments later, they found themselves staring up at the mercenary training grounds' towering walls, an ironclad fortress looming beneath the sky. As the sight hit him, dread crashed over his chest, his eyes went wide in pure shock, and he blurted, "Oh no, so this is what it feels like when your legs start shaking from fear." Fear carved lines into his face, sweat dripped down his forehead, while he swore to himself, "I just want to practice my swings at home and feel myself getting stronger," because the truth of this place hit like a punch. This isn't a game. If you get knocked, it hurts, and if you get cut, you bleed. Fear surged through him, and he pictured the worst: being crushed, ending in defeat. Desperation hit hard. "I don't want to die like that. I need strength to protect myself." Riella saw the panic in his face and quietly urged, "Let's go back home." He swallowed his fear and nodded inside, "I just want to go home." Even with terror crashing down on him, a spark of resolve lit in his chest. He lunged a step forward, voice shaking but unbreakable, and blurted, "Take me on." Riella followed, caught between surprise and worry. Inside the training grounds, a squad of battle-scarred mercenaries sized up the fresh recruits, their faces set in grim judgment and their bodies standing like threats. One mercenary let out a chuckle, saying the rumors about the young master shrinking were real, then shot a glare at him, especially with a girl trailing beside him. Another mercenary didn't buy it either and blurted why the young master had even come to their territory. He faced the mercenaries and begged for swordsmanship training, until one tough, broad-shouldered man with a mustache snorted it off with a dismissive chuckle, acting like the young master's coming for him was ridiculous, until Altos cut through the cold, rough air and paid him out of his own money. That tough Mohawk mercenary with the grim stare cut in and told Altos they didn't have any bikini-armored, big-breasted female adventurers waiting for him, though he couldn't hide the fact that it was a real letdown the young master had shown up. He froze with a stunned huh, eyes bulging in full-on confusion at the sudden statement. The mercenary clocked Altos' confusion and snapped, pressing him for answers like, "You really don't remember." Then he shoved the past in his face, reminding Altos of the time he'd visited the Duke and exploded into a full-blown tantrum. Meanwhile, Altos stood there stunned, wondering what the mercenary was even talking about, and hating himself for not taking the Scamalto route instead. That mercenary kept going, recounting how Altos completely lost it, stormed off, and demanded no training at all, unless a big-breasted, bikini-armored female adventurer was there, and the mustached mercenary just smirked like he was savoring every second of it. Altos snapped his gaze to Riella, his maid, disbelief and worry crashing across his face as he demanded, "Tell me it's true," and she immediately looked away, cheeks blazing with sheer embarrassment. She muttered to herself, slapping the name Scamaltos on him, the most disgusting perverted brat, and then wondered if he was actually serious. He paused and stared at the wild idea of bikini armor, thinking, seriously, why do guys love this stuff so much? From old fantasy tales to today's fan favorites, it's always been there, and part of him couldn't tell if people were laughing at it or the truth behind why it hits so hard. His mind kept racing, remembering how those paid DLC versions of the armor were extra deadly, and how he'd just blown his bonus reward to finish the whole collection. He finally snapped to the truth. This wasn't a problem with the bikini armor at all. It was the Duke's heir demanding some wildly specific, perverted training terms. He tried to backtrack on his demand, insisting he no longer needed a big-breasted, bikini-armored adventurer for sword training, but the head met him with a hard stare and told him they'd only reach out once that kind of adventurer was ready, and for today, he should get out. The mercenaries packed into the training hall and wouldn't let him off the hook, because if he was the Duke's heir, they insisted he couldn't walk back his words so easily, and yeah. They even made it sound like it'd be a real shame if there wasn't some bikini-armored, big-breasted adventurer for them to happily drill in swordsmanship. And that's when he realized they weren't just training him, they were treating him like a walking problem. The mercenaries kept laughing and talking it up openly, one of them shouting that anything bigger than what they'd already got would be a total monstrosity, while a nearby female adventurer, face burning, hands clamped to her chest, muttered, "It's not that big." Still reeling from that brutal public humiliation, he clammed up and said nothing while Maid Riella, always in his corner, tried to calm him down, reminding him that she'd done everything the way he told her, even though his original request had been twisted. He jerked back in pure horror, panic ripping through him as he begged himself not to fall for traps like this, because he'd spent so long trying to fade into the background and dodge this kind of trashy mess, and he still blew it. Riella, still determined to help, leaned in and demanded what he was making her do, then snapped, "Scamaltos." A band of adventurers led by a man rocking a wild mohawk and mustache flat-out balked at jumping in, because teaming up with that infamous scumbag could wreck their name, and the maid didn't even match what the young master demanded, so there was no way they were getting involved. Meanwhile, Altos, the young master, stepped up and promised he'd train the maid himself, thinking with a bitter little sting that people already hated him even before his full transformation into a total scumbag really kicked in, and the maid, stunned by the offer, tried to cut in before he could go any farther. The adventurer leader blinked in disbelief at the young master's call, then Enrique, tall and unshakably confident, strode up and said the young master was right. The maid was a good one. He shut down every worry, swearing that if he personally ran the training, nothing would go wrong. Then he hit the real nerve. If they sent her away, they'd never see her bikini armor again. The leader got it instantly and just like that, agreed to treat the maid with care, exactly like Enrique demanded. Enrique's commanding presence froze everyone in the area in their tracks. Altos and the maid just stared, and Altos couldn't shake the thought that this intimidating giant might be the real leader. Altos kept staring at Enrique, locking onto the calluses on his hands, proof he'd been swinging a sword every day. Then it hit him. Enrique didn't just drop weight, he transformed, and the guy standing there was pure muscle and control, nothing like the person Altos remembered. With everyone gathered, Enrique leaned in and turned to Altos, and the maid too, then demanded a test match with the young master first, insisting they must see exactly what Altos can do right now before any real training begins. Altos narrowed his eyes with pure grit and accepted the challenge, heart pounding as he braced for the confrontation about to explode. Altos stood before a rack of wooden swords, staring them down like they were real weapons because he knew even just wood could smash pain into your bones, one bad swing and you could break something. And still, he couldn't stop wondering. Could Enrique actually throw down for real against someone as young as him? Enrique then flexed his skill. He whipped the wooden sword around with expert ease, the blade slicing the air with a sharp whistle, and Altos stared, locked in on every move. After seeing Enrique's skill, Altos snapped his gaze to the adventurer leader and demanded to know Enrique's rank, making the leader's face light up with real shock, like that question hit harder than anything. He gets confronted on the spot by the female adventurer, who demands to know why they yanked his rank, and the protagonist clocks Enrique's deadbeat energy immediately. Then Enrique just grins and admits the guild stripped him for real, calling it downright embarrassing. Meanwhile, the headmaid clutched her duster and stared at the floor, remembering when that mercenary crew was razor sharp, then grimly realizing all the talented adventurers had vanished from the area. She caught it all, confronted her on why the guild had vanished, and she snapped back. The guild's name hit rock bottom because the prodigy in the house started acting downright strange. Then she broke down the adventure ranks from SS world famous to F apprentice level, and basically admitted that these days most mercenary crews were packed with F-rank adventurers. Later on, the protagonist stood alone and studied a practice sword like it held a secret, then replayed Enrique's near-slip, E, and came to a hard conclusion. Enrique started out as an F-rank adventurer. With a determined stride, he announced he'd see exactly how he stacks up against an F-rank, and he sounded 100% sure it'd be a breeze. His declaration drove him straight into a massive training arena. Now he and Enrique stood face to face, with the entire crowd holding its breath all around them. Enrique gripped his sword and calmly told the young master, "I'm ready, whenever you are." And even though the protagonist admitted Enrique looked scary, a rush of excitement hit him as he lifted his practice blade into stance, while Enrique just watched with a sly smirk. He dropped his eyes a notch, and that confident smirk stayed locked in, fearless. Across the arena, the protagonist's eyes burned with fierce determination, blazing with a brand new resolve. With a thunderous yell, he surged ahead, practice sword blazing toward the front, launching the duel in one explosive move. He lunged in with practiced precision, sword lifted high for a crushing overhead swing right at Enrique, who jolted with a startled look. Enrique spun out of the strike at the last second, the practice sword crashing into the ground where he'd been a heartbeat ago, and he hit the floor hard, talking himself through it like, "Man, that was way too close." From the sidelines, the female adventurer watched in awe. Sure, the young master's moves looked simple, but he was freakishly good. The leader nodded along, and Enrique couldn't help thinking, "I dodged that usual counter technique because I know it." Is that really the whole story, though? Enrique, glowing with a faint edge of power, snapped that if the young master couldn't use body enhancement, then all of this training was pointless, and he swore he'd end the duel with his very next move. The young master just smirked, fully aware he'd hit his limit without body enhancement. Yeah, he couldn't even take an F-rank opponent, but he still decided to go for it. The female adventurer stared at him like he was about to do something reckless, and Enrique caught the young master's unshakable resolve. He still hadn't quit. And just like that, the young master shot forward again, his fist blazing with searing light, catching Enrique totally off guard and ripping a stunned shout out of him. Enrique jerked backward in pure shock when the young master, glowing in a blazing aura, confidently announced he had everything under control. Altos burst forward, sword leveled at Enrique, and shouted, "I've got you." Enrique slammed up a rock-solid block, eyes narrowed tight as he parried the attack with ruthless precision. The two swordsmen kept hammering each other in an all-out spar, steel ringing non-stop as Altos surged forward with relentless attacks, forcing Enrique to stay on the defensive. Suddenly, it hit him. He'd messed up right as Enrique's blade came crashing in and slammed into him with a brutal, sharp impact. He flinched in shock, realizing somehow he'd just slipped out of the blow's full fury, and it hit him in that breath what it meant. Enrique watched his student and hammered it home. In combat, the real game is closing the distance with surgical care and perfect timing. With his instructor's words burning in his chest, Altos surged forward with fresh purpose, his footwork sharp, his steps decisive, and he closed the distance fast. His eyes burned with relentless focus, and they snapped onto his opponent like a trap closing. With a thunderous kick, his foot slammed into the ground and blasted him forward at breakneck speed. He snapped in with a swift, deadly strike, throwing Enrique off balance, then his sword went flying out of his hands. He got whipped backward like a ragdoll, blasting through the wreckage with a savage impact that rattled the whole training ground and sent shockwaves roaring through the air. The crowd gasped as everything flipped in an instant. Enrique watched the hit and spat out a curse, and the maid stared on with wide, trembling eyes. He slammed down hard, debris blasted into the air around him, and a pained grunt ripped out of his chest as dust erupted upward. Still sprawled on the ground, he fought to breathe, gasping hard while a brutal weight crushed his chest. He kept hacking up storms, gripping his chest hard, while the worried maid hovered close, asking if the young master was okay. Tears burned in his eyes as he snapped back. "They tossed me like I weighed nothing, about 3 meters, and I'm not okay." He stormed right up to Enrique, blew steam, and demanded answers. Why did he get kicked that hard? Then he reminded him, "You're just 10, and if your clothes weren't packed with that mob-style defense technique, your organs would have torn wide open." He even snapped, "So tell me, was that really swordsmanship training?" Enrique shot the young master a small, shaky smile and apologized, admitting he'd gotten carried away because Altos was playing so brilliantly, and then he pointed out that Altos was still moving, proving just how tough he really was. While the maid, still dressed far too revealingly, berated Enrique for getting cocky after his win, she sneered that she didn't care one bit about praises for an F rank, as Altos kept coughing, shaken, and humiliated by that counterkick, and Maid Riella watched in confusion, like she couldn't figure out what just happened. The maid fired back that if the young master was really serious, he could wipe out someone like Enrique with a single pinky. Then she brushed it off as pure nerves since it was his first match. Altos was still crumpled on the ground, panicking and begging her to shut it down because it was painfully embarrassing, while Enrique just watched with a grin like he couldn't wait to see how this mess played out. He watched the maid cough hard, cheeks blazing with raw embarrassment after her outburst. Then she grilled Enrique, demanding to know where he'd learned to move like that, before slamming her verdict that the young master was, without a doubt, incredibly strong. The sparring arena turned into pure spectacle. Crowds stared as Enrique stood there like a hero. The maid hovered close by while Altos lay on the ground, still fighting to recover. He snapped his gaze upward, eyes blazing with shock because he just realized every single person in that room was waiting on his next word. He forced himself to stay calm, mapped out the nastiest cutting remark, and decided to unleash a full barrage of complaints and snark on that F-rank adventurer. His mind sprinted through every possible reaction. Either he'd throw a tantrum like a spoiled brat, bragging about how amazing he was and melting down after losing the mock battle, or he'd pull off the sneakier move, acting like that useless bikini armor noble who'd skipped training his whole life, then stepping into the mock battle with total confidence and hitting them with a sarcastic apology right after getting injured. His face stays hard and focused, brow clenched deep in thought as he weighs every move. He decided his ultimate dream was staying in the shadows as a nameless mob character, and yeah, in that exact moment the only move was to play his part. He admitted that kick hurt like hell, and he even owned that his earlier plan for a sarcastic apology was straight up a jerk move. With a real warm smile, he shot up to his feet, thanked them for worrying, and promised everyone, "I'm totally fine." Enrique and the maid stared as he smirked and admitted that, yeah, he'd been confident, but real combat smashed that expectation, and then he cheekily swore he'd knock Enrique out one day. The young master dove into the training and nodded like he'd got it, and Enrique, watching the whole exchange, burst into laughter, a sly smirk tugging at his lips, while Riella, standing right there, stared with worry in her eyes. With training finally done, the young master declared, "I'm out," and Riella, always on the ball, swore she'd confirm their return. As they walked out, Enrique stayed behind, eyes locked on something only he could see, like a storm of thoughts was building in his gaze. From the battlements, the other adventurers watched in stunned silence as the young master changed. More than his looks, his whole presence had shifted, while one of them finally admitted the kid wasn't just brave, he had real guts. They kept the conversation going, jaws dropping at how the young master took Enrique's kick and didn't even flinch. Then one adventurer blurted, "Wait, did Enrique pull his punches?" Enrique caught their comments and shrugged out a vague, half-hearted huh and oh, like he didn't want to promise a thing. He wrestled with what he'd just seen, trying to make his brain accept the way the young master moved, while his buddies kept chattering about that cute girl in bikini armor and arguing whether they'd really witnessed the young master's insane speed. Then it hits him how brutal the young master's final strike was, and he realizes that if an adventurer took that blow head-on, their ribs would be crushed and they'd be shoved straight into retirement. He realized there was no time to hesitate, and his kick hit with pure reflex, full power, no brakes, straight impact. Enrique turned to Jose, the downranked adventurer, and dared him straight up. Did he really think he could take a kick that would have him wrecked and sidelined for 3 whole weeks? He grilled Jose, demanding to know if he really thought a normal guy could take his kick and walk away unhurt. Then Jose frowned and fired back, "Wait, what are you talking about?" Jose shot back, saying only a monster could take a kick from Enrique, because even an A-rank adventurer wouldn't survive a former S-rank strike. Enrique locked eyes with Jose and with a stern face made sure Jose truly understood. Then Enrique zeroed in on the young master, Scamultos. He'd smashed his terrifying kick head-on, and yet he just rose, calm as ever, and stood his ground. Enrique couldn't look away, jaw dropping as he tried to figure out what Scamultos had pulled off. Sure, Scamultos must have reinforced his body, but there wasn't a trace of any magical leakage. Enrique remembered Scamultos' moves weren't amateur at all. They looked like the payoff of relentless, rock-solid training. Meanwhile, the female adventurer who'd seen the young master's training too couldn't stop replaying it in her head, wondering if the person she'd watched really was a maid, and what, in all of it, felt terribly wrong. Her mind flashed straight to that wildly outrageous, big-chested bikini armor, like it shouldn't even be real. She brushed off that shallow comment fast, because it didn't explain the knot in her gut at all. So she stared at the maid's iron determination, and it totally shattered the rumors that claimed the young master had been abandoned by everyone in the manor. Facts just didn't line up. As she snapped the final pieces into place, a chilling truth hit hard. This young master wasn't just lazy and perverted by nature, it was all a twisted fate someone engineered. She replayed every time he'd lunge after maids, the way he'd play up his clumsiness, and the way he'd flat-out refuse to study, and now she finally saw the truth. It was all a staged act to keep his fake persona intact. She finally clocked the truth. Those young masters' perverted laziness, even the forced those aim moments, were just a slick show meant to fool everyone watching. While Ulto's still young, still smiling like he knows exactly what's coming, stands there, a fierce tiger materializes behind him, roaring out his true intentions, and you can tell right then he's about to pull off something huge. From a distance, Enrique clocked everything and his suspicions clicked into place. The Alto's prodigy hadn't been touched at all, with his real power buried under a slick, carefully staged front. Enrique snapped his attention to Jose, saying things were finally heating up, then asking if he was ready. Jose froze, thrown off, and blurted out what the heck was going on. Reich told him the young master must have clocked something deadly, and that meant action right now, so he'd slipped into the disguise of a lazy, perverted little brat to throw the whole world off. Jose, still reeling from the shock, couldn't help but wonder if Enrique had just flipped yet another weird switch, while Enrique only smirked and chuckled, quietly realizing this was getting even more fascinating, because once serious training kicked in, the real game was finally about to start. Far from their conversation, the Grand Randolph family mansion loomed tall beneath a brooding, cloudy sky. Inside the mansion, Altos sprawled in bed, groaning in misery as his stomach twisted in pain, and he snapped that Enrique was driving him up the wall, while Riella stood nearby, eyes full of worry. Riello stormed over, apologized first, then told him she was about to swap out his compress. Riella leaned over him and whispered for him to stay still, promising she'd handle everything, while Altos went bright red, wide-eyed too, and thought, wow, changing a compress like this really feels straight out of an 18-plus game. While Altos Randall kept up his sick act, made Riella's stomach sink. She stared down with worry burning across her face, realizing something else had started to hurt, and it was only getting worse. Kneeling by his bed, she studied his supposed pain like it was a warning sign, then gently reminded him he hadn't leaned on her much lately, because if life ever got hard, she'd be there, no questions asked, and Altos, seizing the moment, fired back with a dramatic claim that his current situation was downright tough. He kept up his smile, flashed a broad grin, and said her scent was honestly amazing. Then he told her to step aside for a moment, praising her loyalty like it meant everything to him, but Riella just stared back, clearly annoyed and totally confused. As she walked away, Altos let out a huge sigh of relief, safe for now, in case he needed help later. And deep down, he knew he'd just barely dodged a disaster because his Scamaltos move proved how close he'd been to ruining everything. With Riella gone, his mind spiraled over what her loyalty really meant. Was the Scamaltos we meet in the main story blown up with ego because Riella's devotion supercharged him, the way he kept showering her with love and feeding her heart every chance he got? He weighed what her devotion really meant, and it hit him. Maybe it was *possible. Lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling and realized that in this new world, Riella's loyalty might be the very thing he needed to fear most. A sudden spike of discomfort yanked his focus away from Riella, and he winced hard, clutching his stomach as he muttered curses in Reich, trying to figure out what was actually wrong with that man. He flashed back to Enrique, an adventurer he'd already written off as a constant F-rank failure, radiating pure loser energy, and a smug little smile tugged at his mouth. Even though he tried to brush it off, something weirdly satisfying hit him when he pinned Enrique as a mob character he'd never actually met in the game, like it gave him total control and proved he was above the story. Realizing what he could do, he admitted he was still just one step under an F-rank adventurer, but somehow he'd kept up with everything as it unfolded, proving his cunning and quick thinking were carrying him. In his lavish chambers, Altos stretched until the ache from Enrique's attack finally faded, and with that last sting gone, he knew this was the moment to jump right back into sword training. Right then, a maid stormed up and announced Master Altos, his magic instructor, had arrived, offering to help him get dressed. His shock exploded when he finally recognized the instructor, Carla Sensei, also known as Carla Orlando or Iris John, one of Last Arcanum's main heroines, and the kind of woman who wrecks you just by standing there with her beauty and sheer dominance. He knew this game's her was a full-on magic caster who'd mastered her arcane arts to the bone, so strong she'd become a permanent, priceless part of the protagonist's party by late game, no doubt. But then dread crept in fast. The official lore never mentioned meeting a main character this early, and now he couldn't shake the feeling this twist might be a bad omen. He forced himself to face the mess he was in, reincarnated as a total trash-tier nobody, trying to survive as just a background mob, while the main storyline of Asterisk Last Arcanum wasn't even close yet, sitting 4.5 years in the future. He refused to meet that heartbreaking end as a lowly trash villain, so he decided to disappear into the shadows, just stay invisible until the real story finally kicked off, no matter which path the plot chose. Even after he tried to stop being a total scumbag, earning the servants' respect, and started sword training just to stay alive, right at that crucial early moment, fate still dumped him face first with a main character. He remembered Carla Sensei from the original game, how she quietly yanked Scamolto's noble rank out from under him and tossed him into a prison cell just to protect Seek, the protagonist. And the moment it hit him, he knew he had to dodge her at all costs, even wondering if some cruel storyline force was already yanking him toward his destined fate. Carla Sensei's eyes lingered on Altos, sharp with questions, like she could feel the chaos inside him and was stunned by what just happened. Altos froze when she suddenly showed up, and before he could even breathe, the dutiful maid rushed in asking if he was okay. Altos only managed a small "oh," still reeling at the sight in front of him. Right in front of him, Altos Randolph finally snapped back into control and introduced himself, while Carlos Sensei barely cared about his name and instead stared at him, saying he'd gotten way too thin. He jolted when he realized Carla Sensei was standing right in front of him, and her face and voice hit him exactly like they did in the game. Up close, her jaw-dropping outfit, boldly revealing, packed with intricate details, hits even harder than you'd expect. Seeing that outfit in real life felt downright criminal to him, and the thought stuck as he took in her whole look. Suddenly, she snapped, her voice cutting as she demanded where he thought he was looking, and called him a pervy brat again, even after his weight loss, saying it was completely unfair. The maid shot in fast, defending Altos as she blurted, "He's not some pervy brat, just a little pervy," and Altos's face lit up with a shocked gasp. She flashed a knowing smile and told Altos that even if his servant tried to spin it, he'd finally see what everyone really thought of him, right down at the core. He couldn't stop wondering why she was treating him so differently than the game's protagonist, and the second he saw Carla Sensei's smug grin, his chest started pounding like a war drum. Then her face softened and she dropped a shocking truth: sometimes it's okay to lean on people, and you don't have to grind yourself into the ground every single day. She pulled him close like a warm blanket, and it hit Altos like a gut punch. He remembered a time when it wasn't the current protagonist who felt that kind of ache, it was him, and sorrow slammed through his chest, threatening to steal the tears right out of his eyes. After Carla Sensei wrapped her in comfort, she stepped up to Altos, her whole mood changing in an instant, as she declared she was there to hand over his magic aptitude test results. She demanded a private meeting, and Altos clocked that she'd never sounded this blunt. A maid immediately confirmed a room was free and offered to escort them. As they finally started moving, Altos kept his eyes locked on Carla-sensei and the maid as they walked ahead. He already knew the test results thanks to how well he understood the game, but the moment she demanded a private talk like they always did for personal stuff such as magic aptitude, unease still crawled up his spine. Just as Alto's thoughts were locked in, a sudden, piercing noise snapped him out. Altos spun around, startled, and Carla-sensei stumbled into view, wide-eyed with shock, and he immediately demanded to know if she was okay. Out of nowhere, she slipped hard, then her legs gave out completely, and she crashed to the ground with a quiet, crushing thud. He stared in stunned silence as she crumpled to the floor, his eyes snapping wide. Because she didn't get hit by anything at all, she just tripped and fell. Carla-sensei, the magic instructor, was sprawled on the floor like she'd just been blindsided, and Riella, the maid, bolted over to ask if she was okay, while Altos just stared on, worry written all over his face. With zero panic on her face, she started patting down her witch's hat, then slid it back onto her head like nothing happened, trying to shake the whole incident off. Riella, the maid, tried her best to explain, and she calmly confirmed that Carla-sensei had only just tripped, so the instructor snapped her gaze up with a stunned, almost dazed look. Altos watched that exchange unfold and couldn't help thinking, Carla-sensei is the real deal, seriously smart and unreal to look at, but she's also got that unmistakable clumsy streak that makes her endearing in the biggest way. Riella, cheeks burning, shot Carla-sensei a quick reassurance that it was nothing, then eagerly grabbed the reins and promised to keep guiding her. Carla-sensei, her face set in seriousness, just accepted the offer without a single hesitation. As they pressed on through the mansion's towering halls, Altos couldn't stop replaying how the maid snapped into action. Riella had played her part perfectly to shield Carla-sensei from even more humiliation, and this wasn't nothing at all. He also clocked the other staff moving around like it was all normal, a dark-haired maid, a butler, and everyone else quietly doing their jobs. Later, seated across from Altos at the table, Carla-sensei's voice went deadly serious. Before she even showed his results, she dropped the bomb. She was quitting as his tutor. She kept going, saying she'd taught a stack of noble kids, but she'd never seen anyone with less manners than him, and she honestly couldn't wrap her head around how a person could end up like that. Meanwhile, Altos congratulated himself in his head, thinking he'd just dodged a bullet. Then he flashed a huge, relieved grin like, "Yep, I dodged that bullet." His secret relief didn't last a second. Carla-sensei clocked his real feelings, pinned him with a scorching stare, and demanded, "So what's so funny to you?" He got blindsided by her straight-up question, stammered out an apology, and insisted he'd been too distracted by her beauty to hear most of what she said, then even admitted it was only half the truth. Still unimpressed by his flattery, she snapped that he was creeping her out, scribbling weird looks and smirking to himself, while she demanded he actually listen in her lectures. Desperately, yet even with her harsh warning ringing in the air, his thoughts still drifted to the time he begged her to teach him spells to make girls' clothes see-through, or to peep on them in the bath. Carla-sensei had heard enough of his creepy requests and rotten behavior, so she slammed down her decision to quit, announcing today would be her final day, and he swallowed the resignation while silently branding his own actions as classic schmaltos. Right before she left, she handed him a document and told him, straight up, that his magic appraisal dragged on longer than usual because she'd never seen a result like his before. Just as she started to brag about how rare his magical gift was and that it was space magic, he snapped her speech in half and said, straight up, that he'd already figured it out from playing a game. Carla-sensei's explanation snapped to a stop. She stared at him in shock, blurted, "What's wrong?" and reminded him how brutally hard it was to dig out that rare attribute. Sensing his dead silence, she snapped, "Listen up," and laid it out. Spatial magic isn't just some trick, it's a legendary class. She pushed on and the twist hit harder. His rare power wasn't just special, it was tied to ancient lore itself. Spatial magic was what the final boss wielded, and also what the one chosen to defeat him would inherit. Far off, a massive castle rose from the horizon, and Altos, Carla-sensei, and a third figure launched their march straight toward it. He'd just been handed legendary spatial magic, and instead of celebrating, he sounded genuinely deflated, saying the original Scamaltos only used it for filthy stuff, so being picked felt like the exact opposite of his dream to stay a nobody mob character. And then Carlos-sensei pushed back, asking why he wasn't more fired up about a power almost no one could master. Yep, Scamaltos didn't just use his power, he unleashed it for sick, depraved stuff, turning walls see-through so he could spy on girls in the bath, yanking their skirts up for a closer look, and then going even further until their clothes vanished too. That snap completely flipped him into a full-on scumbag, and every girl in school started to hate him for it. Altos replayed it in his head. Yeah, a player might have called it funny, but from Scamolto's POV, that was straight-up torture. And the moment he imagined being the one stuck there, he knew he'd trade it for normal magic in a heartbeat. He kept wrestling with the idea in his head, then landed on one brutal truth: forget turning walls or clothes invisible. If he had that power, he'd just vanish himself. Carla-sensei sat across from him at the table, eyes locked on his face, replaying every word, because did he really just confess he wanted normal magic? She paused with the badge in hand, and it hit her. This power should have thrilled him, but he was terrified to stay seen, so she pressed him, demanding what that really meant. A heavy thought slammed into her. Were those words the real truth, the way he truly felt? As Alto stared down, stuck in his own thoughts, Carla-sensei leaned in and wondered if he was terrified he'd end up hurting people with that crushing magic, or if, deep in his bones, he'd always known just how massive his power really was. Once she really thought it through, she realized his act of playing the dumb, scummy noble wasn't random at all. It was the perfect cover to keep everyone else at arm's length. After reading Alto's pain like an open book, she flashed him a soft, comforting smile and said, "I changed my mind. I'm not leaving you." His eyes went wide with pure disbelief as her words hit him out of nowhere. Then a sharp "ha" slipped out of his mouth while the truth of her promise finally landed. Carla Orland, the moment she introduced herself, had everyone whispering, "This girl's a cold-blooded genius," and even the Royal Capital's Mage Guild and the Magic Academy, top-tier spellcasters, kept her on a pedestal. She smirked like she knew the rumors were true. Some folks even flat-out crowned her the greatest spellcaster of their time. Then she dropped the mask and admitted something brutal. She didn't like people, not even a little, and she actively dodged every conversation. She remembered back to when she was a genius from the start, and it made everyone misunderstand her again and again until she was left alone. Even trying to build relationships started to feel like a bother, like a weight she didn't want to carry anymore. And right now, she clutched Altos to her like he was lifeline, his head pressed to her chest, while her heart raced, wondering if it all really ended like this. He stammered out a flustered mess and hesitated, then finally called out, "Miss Carla." She stared down at him and her face softened. Then she reassured him, "I get you, because I'm the same." There was no way she'd abandon him to rot in loneliness. He could only blurt out a shocked "huh," while still pressed against her, his face burned with sheer confusion. He got pinned against Carla's chest, and for one shaky moment, his mind got completely sidetracked by that unexpected softness. But the moment his first reaction hit, panic surged instead, because he couldn't stop thinking, how did I end up in this intimate, total mindbender again, as he desperately fought to steady himself. Carla clutched him tighter, whispering that everything would be okay, while his face stayed buried against her as he quietly wrestled with his own thoughts and tried to make sense of how close he felt. Carla kept her grip on him, and suddenly her whole vibe clicked in his head, because back in the game, he'd already cleared her route 10 times, and 9 of those endings were straight-up pure romance, so yeah, he voiced it loud. He loved her, and she was one of his favorite characters. His mind snapped back to the moment, and bliss flooded through him like he was floating, because this insane closeness with Carla wasn't a dream anymore. She kept holding him close and gentle, and those tiny, ethereal hearts seemed to glow right out of her, pouring out pure, overflowing love. Panic slammed into him, screaming that this whole situation was wrong, but he shoved that thought aside, because the only thing that mattered was what was happening next. He finally felt the full weight of his situation crash down on him. The game's big events weren't for another 4.5 years, so his hard-earned future knowledge barely mattered right now. And all he wanted was a calm life as a background character, steering clear of disaster with foresight, until he got thrust into this close, eye-to-eye moment with a heroine that completely wrecked his plan, leaving him totally lost on what to do next. As the hug finally eased, he jerked his head up and locked eyes with Carla, who was leaning over him, staring straight down. She told him there'd be no lesson today because she had other plans, then turned serious and promised that starting tomorrow she'd teach him magic, making it crystal clear she was going to be strict. She'd just sworn she was going to teach him magic, and Altos, still stunned by how close that moment felt, burst into an embarrassing, blazing blush, whispering to himself, "Okay, fine," while he kept trying not to admit she was absolutely gorgeous. Right before she stormed out, Carla Orland Drisaka snapped her gaze on him and made it crystal clear. No more acting like a sleazy perv around her. Altos was still red-faced, but he just managed, got it. With one last look, she said, "See you then," and as maid one hovered by the door, she exited the room. Even after she was gone, Altos stayed breathless and burning inside, his thoughts still chained to her, until he finally blurted out in silence, "I love you, Carla-sensei." His obvious distress didn't slip past anyone. He watched that blazing red face, stepped in with concern, and asked straight up if he had a fever. She pressed into him, and her concern practically spilled out of her. Altos shot a glance away, mortified, and mumbled some half-explanation, like maybe he was just nervous and a little worn out. As the crew stormed through the grand hall, Altos' mind raced about his terrifying bind. There wasn't a single clear answer to make a confident move, and the wrong step could slam the dreaded death flag in his face. So for now, he decided to stay smart and play it safe with Carlos. Just a little later, a neat stack of sliced sandwiches and a steaming cup of tea were waiting, like the calm eye of the storm, for a moment. While Altos ate, the original timeline clawed at his mind, Carlos-sensei secretly pulling strings, stripping him of his title, and tossing him into prison just like that. Altos chewed in silence, and a steely new resolve snapped into his expression. This time, it would never happen. The afternoon sun blazed over the mercenary training grounds, an iron fortress where warriors sharpened their skills until they were battle-ready. Altos was drilling his sword swings when he finally struck himself again, blade biting flesh, as a sharp cry of pain and pure frustration burst from him. With a smug smirk, the man offered to teach him how to dodge every hit, laughing that all those constant collisions could cost him his hair. Then he grabbed Altos' attention and taught him the real technique: duck your head out of the line, don't get caught showing it off himself with a sharp, precise swing of his own sword. After practice, their instructor casually dropped the question that hit like a spark: was Altos' magic tutor really Carla Orland? Altos blinked in surprise and snapped back, asking how he even knew, because yeah, that felt oddly unsettling. Then the instructor just laughed and said Carla Orland was a big-name celebrity, something everyone was constantly talking about. The instructor basically declared that Carla-sensei was a legit legend, young, gorgeous, stacked, and ridiculously strong, and the Altos just stared with a thinking look like they were absorbing it all. He couldn't stop himself from second-guessing the instructor's words, and part of him worried he was the fool for buying it. Meanwhile, the narrator dropped the truth: Carla Orland really was the capital's top mage, the one nobles begged for to teach their kids, and just like they expected, the Randolph family snagged her services without a hitch. The sword instructor flashed a smug grin and dropped a rumor about Altos, saying the young master pitched a tantrum and demanded a magic tutor who was both stunning and blessed generously. Then Altos stood there betrayed and mortified, only blinking out a confused, "Seriously?" While the instructor laughed at his classic reaction. He kept going, telling Altos he finally understood his real intentions, and promising to be there with help anytime Altos ever needed it. Altos still can't wrap his head around it, and inside he shrugs off the instructor's words as the clueless blabber of an F-rank adventurer. Later, across from Carla-sensei, Altos dropped his decision like a bomb: he'd dedicate every morning to her magic lessons, because leveling up was his #1 priority right now. He mapped out his brutal schedule too, saying every afternoon would be spent honing sword skills with Enrique, and somehow even he, an F-ranker, still had real lessons to share. 6 months vanished in a blur of relentless training, and Altos stayed locked in, so focused, so driven, that he squeezed every spare second to cast body enhancement, stacking spell after spell to power himself up even more. Suddenly, the door slammed open and the maid barreled in, her voice shaking as she blurted that a message had just arrived from the Lord. She told Altos that his father would be back home in a year and warned him this message wasn't like the others. Altos froze, then snapped, "Why is this one different?" Why did he absorb the news, and why was that thoughtful look burning in his eyes? Altos couldn't stop wondering if his father's sudden return was tied to all the monsters stalking their territory, and the moment it hit him, this would be their first meeting since his reincarnation. Nervous dread slammed into his chest like a warning bell. He listened as the maid spilled the news. His father's letter demanded a meeting with the whole family in a nearby town, and his eyes bulged, thrown off by the sudden mention of that place. The maid, locked in the details, called out Lyon by name, and her eyes slid toward that distant city skyline like she knew exactly what was waiting. A cold shiver tore down his spine, his eyes popping wide as the truth hit like a punch. He knew exactly what was about to happen. The maid clocked the panic on his face and demanded, "Are you okay?" And he snapped back that Lyon was a town, his thoughts racing like crazy. He desperately wished he was anywhere else, but when the maid saw how much he knew, her eyes lit up. She confirmed there really was a village near Lyon, just like he'd remembered. His face hardened and a grim certainty slammed into him, no question about it. It was that Lyon. Every single last arc player knew Lyon as the starting town, and 3 years before the main story even kicked off, a disaster tore through it. So in Lyon's world, it's worse. That same catastrophe is coming again 1 year from now. A dark grin cracked across his face the moment he understood the truth, and that single moment is what kickstarted Alto's full, terrifying plunge into villainy. He clenched his teeth and swore to himself he'd never make it to Lyon, then vowed to find a way to dodge the disaster that was already closing in. In the grand estate, a maid rushed up to Alto's, worried sick as she stared at his pale face, asking if he was even okay. Then he snapped back that he was fine, only to turn around and demand to know what color she thought he looked. Even with that confident front, he quietly confessed to himself he was anything but okay, and worry twisted across his face like a storm. The city of Lyon, aka the City of Beginnings, hits you like a tutorial episode in the main story, but this one feels totally different, and it begs the question, why? Duke and Duchess threw a stunning party that looked perfect on the outside, but while everyone toasted in fine clothes, something darker was already moving behind the scenes. Because in Last Arcana, during the Roge tutorial, it drops you right into a sneaky setup where masked women in barely their outfits offer you choices like kiss her, hug her, or talk her. At the heart of this secret, way more illicit get-together was Kazuto's, his face twisted into a nasty smirk as he stuck his tongue out. Once he'd stumbled into the Black Curtain's trap, he got dragged into a filthy game, hemmed in by masked women swinging whips and toying with him, even one sliding in with a flirty, suggestive plea, right as the emerald prize of the game came into play. A bunch of people in the crowd just froze in shock and disgust, whispering like, "It's real, it's really real. I saw it with my own eyes. He's a total pervert, a filthy scumbag, and the kind of rogue who belongs nowhere." Meanwhile, Carla-sensei, jaw set tight, watched the chaos roll in, knowing the main heroine would grow to hate him like a snake, and that the truth of his rot as a corrupt noble and a full-on eroge creep would explode from the estate and hit the whole world, sealing his fate as a mid-boss villain for good. Alto sprawled on his bed, replaying everything in his head, and figured this was basically the first half of the City of Beginnings, Lyon. He shrugged off the rest, since the second half was all battle tutorials and the same kind of stuff that didn't really matter to him. He sprawled in bed, eyes blazing with worry and deep thought, replaying everything that had just happened. He weighed the tutorial's social chaos, the wild, scandalous party Kazuto's threw, and that symbolic villain vibe, and thought, honestly, you could just dodge the whole thing or skip lying altogether. But this wasn't any ordinary world, it was something way wilder. He jolted upright, realizing he'd been dropped into an eroge world, and it felt like some terrifying force was yanking the story's strings, making everything unfold exactly the way it was supposed to. He figured out that the rules from his old world wouldn't work here, so he slammed the brakes on everything else. His first mission was to hunt down information. The Mercenary Corps training grounds loomed like an unbreakable fortress, where every fighter risked it all and forged their skills. When Altos finally arrived, he straight up asked about Enrique, only for a guard to tell him Enrique disappeared to the Pleasure District last night and still hadn't come back, and Altos couldn't hide his shock. Just as the guard turned away, Jose slid in, Altos' training partner. He grinned and introduced himself, telling the guard to expect him to fall in line with Altos' every move while Altos pressed for details. What kind of training would this be? Jose answered straight up. They'd usually run through 5 basic matches. Jose watched Altos drill his basic sword moves over and over, laser-focused, studying every piece of his form as he worked. Once the basic drills wrapped up, Jose nodded and said the foundation was done, then he pushed them to take on the 5-match bow next. He stood poised with a training sword in his grip, and his partner, Jose, bowed politely, "Please take care of me." Altos matched his readiness and shot back, "Whenever you are, I'm ready." With that declaration, he exploded forward like lightning, so fast Jose could barely blink, then his eyes went wide as Alto's blade slammed in, forcing Jose to scramble for a desperate block. What? The speed, Jose couldn't believe it. His brutal onslaught kept rolling, a blinding storm of punches that forced Jose on the defensive, scrambling to block every hit while he studied the whirlwind of motion and quietly focused on reinforcing his own body. The training sword snapped through the air again, screaming proof that his speed never faltered. Jose's body still buzzed from that sudden, brutal impact when he finally understood it. His opponent had just scored the first point. "No way," he muttered, staring in shock as disbelief burned across his face. Jose's chest tightened with grim focus as the stakes hit him. If he didn't go all out, he wouldn't even land a spot as a training partner, and getting fired suddenly felt real. The weight of it all crashed down on him, and then he snapped, "All right, second match, whenever you're ready." As he geared up for the next round, Jose stared hard at Altos, and then it hit him. "Wait, his swing is slow." "No, Altos is just slow, period." "Idiot," he muttered, even as that messy insult turned into a deeper, more ruthless read on the guy's technique. The sword instructor struck again and stripped Altos of his weapon for the fifth straight round, and this time, Altos threw in the towel. Altos gave the practice a respectful nod, but the instructor, still stunned by what just happened, couldn't stop cursing the fact that he'd just lost all 5 matches to the young master. He clenched his jaw and replayed every hit in his head. Altos had faked him with that lightning-fast start, so he panicked and guarded too much, and that sealed his defeat. But the excuses instantly crumbled when he finally realized it wasn't a trick at all. The young master was just genuinely strong. Meanwhile, Altos replayed the instructor's moves in his head, and something felt off, because Jose looked way weaker than Enrique, and Altos even started wondering if Jose's rank was lower too. Still, he was relieved his mob-style body strengthening had paid off, since he didn't need to lean on it during their spar. Jose, the instructor, kept his private evaluation going, clocking that Altos had a solid personality, came off as genuinely capable, and looked like he knew exactly what he wanted. Altos, 1 whole year deep into his reincarnation, decided to track down Jose and ask for his take, since the instructor had more experience than anyone else. Then he stopped and wondered if he should dare to ask a question. The story snapped to an imposing castle, its stone walls clawing up toward the sky, and Altos couldn't shake the same question in his head. Was it really okay to run the moment danger came roaring in? Jose stood beside the sword instructor and swore that when danger hits, you ditch everything and run, because for an adventurer, survival comes first, and death gives you nothing to show for it. The instructor nodded, thanked him, and accepted the lesson. A delicate tea set sat on a polished table. The calm right before Altos' lingering question crawled back in: what exactly counts as a really dangerous situation? Altos then found himself talking to Carla-sensei, and she demanded to know if he'd run into trouble. He told her he was just trying to learn what to do if things ever got messy, and she only smiled and called him my disciple. He kept the conversation rolling with Carla-sensei, and the moment she heard his worries, she didn't hesitate. She promised that if he ever needed help, it would be easy, and told him to come straight to her. His face broke into a real, warm smile the second her offer hit. Suddenly everything felt safe, steady, and completely trustworthy. Still, a quick flash of worry hit him, because yeah, Carlos-sensei could fix anything, but once she got involved, it would spark a whole new mess. He stared at Carla-sensei's crushing power and realized she was so overpowered she'd feel unfair even in a top-tier protagonist party, then wondered if the devs had secretly slipped her a weird weakening drug just to balance things out. But nope, even with that, she still stood there terrifyingly formidable. He fired off the same goal again: stay in the shadows, be nothing but background noise, and do everything in his power to avoid drawing attention, especially when the strongest guy in the story is right there, fighting like a rampaging force of nature. Carla-sensei clocked how suddenly he went silent and asked what was on his mind, and he snapped back that her kindness had him genuinely touched. She doubled down on her promise, telling him to come to her for real the moment danger starts rising, and when he did, he thanked her with real gratitude. Moments later, a maid strode up, totally baffled, and apologized because she couldn't quite catch his words, then begged him to say it again. He leaned in, joked that maybe her ears had gone bad, and then explained he'd just asked Carla-sensei the right way to handle real danger. Yet the maid only blinked, still totally confused, and answered with a shaky question mark, yes. The maid's face tightened with pure irritation at his words. He stammered, instantly clocked the blunder, and scrambled to fix it by asking her to tell him what to do when danger turns truly deadly. He kept going, bluntly saying that if you're already stuck in danger, you already screwed up somewhere, so the maid leaned in and told him the truth. A noble's real fight is prepping early, so that kind of nightmare never even shows up. He drank in her words, and a cold thought slipped out of his mouth. The maid fixed him with a stare and tossed the question right back, demanding to know what he really planned to do when real danger finally showed up. With a sly, confident grin, he announced he'd drop everything and run, because what's the point if you're dead? That blunt honesty totally caught the maid off guard. His face flickered with a quick jolt of confusion, trying to figure out what could have sent the maid into that kind of shock. Still rattled, the maid demanded answers, so he really meant he'd drop everything and walk away. He just nodded with a shaky, hesitant murmur. Then she dragged his past words back into the light, claiming that just last year he swore he'd awaken to noblesse oblige, and she pressed him hard. So was this new stance just another lie? The maid, clearly shaken, blurted out that she'd overstepped and begged forgiveness for acting like more than a servant. Then he dropped into a deep bow, apologized right back, and thanked her for the advice. As the maid drifted out of sight, he stewed in silence. What he wanted all along wasn't real nobility at all, but a twisted, shattered noble duty he'd turned into a kind of corrupted obligation. A massive mansion loomed beneath a heavy, cloudy sky, its towering walls quietly watching as that strange conversation unfolded. He sprawled across the couch, hands laced behind his head, as a shocking realization hit him. He'd obsessed over becoming a character who could escape being trash, and in the process, he'd nearly turned into a real trash noble himself, and he almost walked straight into disaster. His face hardened as he kept digging through the truth, and it hit him. Becoming a trash noble was the total opposite of the mob kid he swore he'd be, so when it came down to it, fleeing was the only last play he had left. Altos, wearing a worried face, demanded confirmation, like he had to be sure everything was truly okay, checking every detail like it mattered more than anything. Her cheeks burned as she stared at him with wide, shocked eyes. Then she finally mustered the courage to ask, was he really about to unseal that thing? Inside the rattling carriage, Jose sat alongside the sword instructor and another mercenary guard, and the instructor shot a quick nod like he'd just figured it out, while Jose silently read the moment too. Altos kept his face dead serious and told her he understood her worry, but this wasn't some erotic stunt. He was doing it for a much bigger goal. The maid, now wearing a sweet little smile, leaned in and promised she wouldn't stand in his way, then slid in a teasing line. She was always ready for the unsealing. Altos shut his eyes tight, frowned hard, and swore this unsealing would happen once, because he was done risking a bad ending. Her eyes popped wide and the maid snapped her gaze into the carriage interior, where the sword instructor and the others sat, clearly trying to process Altos' words. She dropped her gaze, disappointment crushing her face, and admitted, softly but fully, that she had to accept his choice. The sword instructor narrowed his eyes, stared at the strange turn of events, and wondered, was this really a normal unsealing or something far darker hiding beneath it? He stared at the woman's skimpy outfit, calling the bikini armor and the N likely fakes, while Altos, shocked by seeing her, snapped at Enrique, "What are you doing?" And the woman, just as stunned, wondered whether she was talking to Bakken. Ahead of them lay Lyon, the biggest city in the Londal territory and one of the kingdom's crown jewels. But in the game's original path, that's exactly where Altos' scumification would explode forward, and it was absolutely the last thing anyone wanted. That scumification was a sneaky trap meant to slip past everyone's defenses, an evil older sister scheme to snare Liera, with multiple women in black lingerie and masks closing in. Altos stared off, hand to his chin, and realized he'd butchered the game's story. His intentions never landed the way he meant them to. A woman in a maid uniform, head bowed and eyes heavy, admitted she never lasted anywhere. No matter how strong her start looked, she got booted fast, and when she finally lifted her gaze, she questioned in a gentle tone. The sword instructor froze in pure disbelief, snapped that it was a total waste, and muttered that whoever pulled the trigger on her clearly didn't understand what truly matters. He kept running his inner checklist, clocking her stunning looks and generous curves, then couldn't help wondering, was her personality just as rare? From the edge of the bed, the sword instructor spun toward the maid and asked if she truly agreed with his judgment. Then he dropped the bomb. In the game, Kazutos had also fired her. Altos just gave a low, knowing sound like it all clicked. The maid blinked in shock, cheeks warm with embarrassment, then blurted out a thank you, confessing she was clumsy enough to smash countless dishes and stir up one disaster after another, even in her own new home. Altos and the sword instructor just froze, completely stunned by her confession. Altos blurted the question in a clumsy mess, and the sword instructor repeated it like he'd dropped a mouthful of broken dishes. Lyra, the new maid, spilled the story to him. She was one mistake away from getting fired, and Master Altos slammed the brakes in time. Then she repeated his words word for word. Anyone who tried to kick her out would face his wrath, and he wouldn't let it go. The sword instructor stared on with a steely face, while Altos froze in shock at Liara's bombshell, the name Kazuto's hanging there like it was alive. Lear's eyes burned with quiet resolve as she spoke. That's why. She pressed on, dead set on it. No matter what kind of maid Altos wanted, she'd become that exact maid for him. Altos, still reeling from her fiery confession, pressed her for the truth. Why would she go to those extremes for him? He pushed on, baffled that she was so obsessed with being a maid, especially when she was insanely clumsy, too, and even the sword instructor fired off the same question. What were her real duties supposed to be? Yara froze, caught off guard, and stammered a reply. Then she ripped open the truth about her past. Kazuto's and those villainous creeps had treated her like a kid, yanking her hand wherever they went so she'd never get a moment alone, and she swore she'd do anything for Altos, even if it meant suffering the same way. Liara kept going, her voice dripping with sorrow, telling them that just lately all those treatments had stopped completely, and the silence left her aching with loneliness. The sword instructor and the Altos leaned in, faces twisted between worry and pure confusion. Altos, totally flustered by her relentless devotion, shot back fast. He was denying having a mother complex and insisting he wouldn't just accept things on blind faith. Ryan's grand city towered over everything beneath a heavy, cloudy sky, its jaw-dropping architecture stealing the whole show. Inside the city, Jose pulled a mercenary guard and a maid aside and told them to stick to their plans, reminding them that he'd been the one shielding the young master from the front lines. Then the maid just nodded, yes. Soon enough, the crew finally rolled up to Ryan Villa, the Randall Ducal House's grand, noble residence. Inside, a neat line of household staff, starting with the butler and flanked by two maids, stood poised to greet them, and the butler snapped into a formal welcome for the young master while one maid hurriedly added, "We've been waiting for you." As Altos strode in, Jose and Liara right beside him, he stared at the welcoming crowd, and realization hit hard when he saw the maid chief standing there. As they pushed deeper into the villa, the head maid spilled that they'd been prepping for the young master's arrival, and his whole entourage, while Altos stared, suddenly sure this wasn't the first time she'd said it. Then the maid chief leaned in and told Altos his parents were due back by evening. Until then, he was completely free to roam town however he wanted, and Altos immediately nodded, grinning that he'd go sightseeing. Inside, he couldn't believe it. The same scenery from the game stared back at him, and it hit him with a rush of deep, overwhelming emotion. Altos and Liara drifted through Ryan's loud, crowded market when an old food vendor lit up and greeted them like she'd been waiting, asking if it was their first time in town and praising how wonderful Ryan was. Liara nodded politely, but Altos grinned like he knew a secret and admitted he'd been here again and again in the game. An old woman beamed at them and launched into a shout-out. Mayor Gregorio, she said, was the reason Ryan's life is thriving. She called him an amazing man too, even though he rose from humble roots as just another commoner like them. Lyra beamed and marveled that every citizen adored their kind mayor, while Altos kept grinding on his own strange thoughts, realizing once again that this whole world felt exactly like the game he knew. He kept strolling through town with Liara, and she pointed out that everyone they ran into had nothing but praise for the mayor. Altos only hummed in agreement, like he already knew Gregorio's reputation was everywhere. Altos already had the truth. Mayor Gregorio, adored by everyone in the city, was secretly a cunning villain wearing a friendly face. He mentally charted where Gregorio sat in the story, realizing that sure, he showed up during the Academy arc like a mid-game obstacle, but his real power crushed any normal mid-boss, making him a top-tier antagonist, a monster who could even go toe-to-toe with the final boss. He walked away convinced that Gregorio was an even bigger headache than Kazuto's, another mid-boss tearing things up during the Academy arc. Now it hit him, if he ever spilled Gregorio's real identity to anyone, they'd all swear he'd lost his mind. In this Ryan arc, it finally hit him. There was only one move left: confront that top-tier boss and take him down. His game knowledge was his deadliest weapon, but if he bent the scenario around it, he could get himself killed in an instant, so he even thought about running, then crushed the idea. Winning was terrifying to imagine, because if he lost, they'd call him trash and slam him into a horrible end. And the worst part, if he weakened that only edge, his knowledge, then there was no way he could win at all. He let out a quiet sigh, because back when he first learned his original knowledge, he truly thought it would make him invincible, only to find that using it for real was brutally harder than he ever imagined. Liara spotted the sickly pale on his face and shot, "You okay?" and he insisted he was fine, but the tension in his expression screamed otherwise, so he urged them to head back to the villa ASAP. Soon, just as they were about to leave, he pulled the sword instructor aside and demanded he investigate one specific matter. Then the instructor nodded immediately, promised he'd handle it, and rode off in a carriage. The Orland Rusaka family's grand estate rose under the morning sky, its classical architecture screaming pure prestige and old money power. Alto's father and mother finally swept back into their grand halls, stepping in with regal pride while watchful maids flanked them at every side. As they stepped inside, Altos was already waiting, shooting his father and mother a calm, respectful greeting, and admitting it had been ages, even though this was the very first real meeting in his current life. Right beside him, the head maid bowed in to welcome the master and mistress with the same reverence. His father spotted him and blurted out in shock. Altos had grown so much he looked almost nothing like himself. As he watched her, Alto couldn't stop thinking about his mother's jaw-dropping beauty, and heat rushed straight to his cheeks. Then her eyes snapped to him, her gaze widening as she said his name, pure recognition hitting her all at once. His eyes went wide and a silent "why" sparked in his head the moment he locked onto her intense stare. Emily's eyes narrowed with worry as she blurted, "Where is my beloved Ulcan?" Her eyes sharpened, and the very next second, a young boy named Ulthus snapped into action with a gasp of pure, stunned surprise. She hauled him in close, beaming softly as she finally admitted she'd misjudged him, and that seeing him had totally thrown her for a loop. She shoved his face into her chest, whispered "Mother," and cradled the moment with a warm, comforting touch. Emily wiped a tear from her eye and begged him not to feel lonely, and he immediately reassured her he was okay, while his mind spiraled back to his mother's jaw-dropping beauty, her rare appearances in the game's main story, and the fact that some of Mama Suki's cream had finally made its way into him. Later, inside a grand hall, Dominic, the family patriarch, laid a hand on his chest, smiled like he'd just found peace, and praised Ulthus for becoming so solid and dependable. Alpha flashed a smile of pure gratitude at his father, who just nodded like, "Looks like you're doing fine." Then Alpha's mind started racing. What did it really mean to be taken to Gregorio? When everyone finally sat together, Dominic dropped the bombshell. Tomorrow meant a demon countermeasure conference, then straight into a party where Ulthus would make his social debut as if he were royalty, and Emily quickly soothed him. It was just a formal introduction, no reason to panic. Ulthus nodded and with iron resolve promised he'd carry the Randall name with pride. That evening, the whole family dug into dinner together, and Emily couldn't help asking about Ulthus's sudden weight loss. He just said it came from training and hard exercise. Dominic couldn't stop talking about how much he'd changed. Then, after the plates were cleared, they all called it a night early, ready to gear up for whatever tomorrow would throw at them. Later, in Ulfus' bedroom, Amelie stood by the door and told him, "Call me if you need anything, I'll be right next door," and once he nodded back, he sent her off with a good night. He stirred in his sleep, a soft little sigh spilling out as he slowly started to wake up. As his mind snapped into focus, a warm image lit up: long, wavy brown hair, a gentle smile, clearly Iris, the heroine of the game, and today was the day the player was meant to meet her and fall closer. But in his role as the villain, he could only watch from the outside, gripping the sting of being shut out. The thought of Iris right now with anyone but him tore at his nerves like fire, and he just couldn't shut his eyes as that rage kept replaying every awful scene in his head. He clenched his teeth, fully awake, and a wave of pure injustice surged through him. So why did fate keep trying to paint him as the villain? Then his mind snapped into a vivid picture of Iris Weyburn, the Duke's granddaughter and one of the heroines of last arc, the woman his past self had loved with his whole heart, and right under that image, his past self buried in a game seemed to silently prove it. He couldn't stop thinking it. Her face was pure magic, sculpted so perfectly it looked unreal. Then her bust hit like a direct jump scare. Yeah, in the Academy arc she was clearly built, but he forced himself to clamp down and play it cool, because this was still just a tutorial. Her eyes burned crimson like fresh embers, guarding a heart that refused to break, because he loved her more than words could ever hold. Meanwhile, Iris is hauling toward Lyon, cutting through Hafen and the Randall territory, and believe me, this trip has a very specific reason. In her homeland, the Vabron territory, a massive monster outbreak is confirmed, and the moment the threat hits, Vabron is pushed to the breaking point. She was racing toward Lyon, where the Demon Countermeasure Conference would kick off tomorrow, and her mission was simple on paper but brutal in real life: win over the nobles, even though she was only 12. As the conference day crept closer, Ulthus, still tucked in, eyes shut, kept dreaming of her because in his heart he knew that tomorrow he'd finally face the real Iris, not just the screen image he'd seen. The very next day, Lyon's grand streets roared to life under a blazing clear sky. Inside the city, the Demon Countermeasure Conference was already roaring to life, cooked up by the neighboring lords, and Ulthus knew the game's script this late in the scenario. No real counterplan could possibly work. When the final piece clicks into place, and just like that, night crashes in, the stage is finally set. That evening, the Lion Mayor's residence erupted with life as a booming crowd packed in for a massive, headline-worthy party. In the middle of the loud, crowded chaos, Duke Randall got stopped by the Duchess Linder, who asked, politely but firmly, that he introduce his son, and with a proud grin, he stepped forward and presented him like it was the highlight of his whole world. Ulthus, always polite, strode up to the Duchess and introduced himself, then realized the moment he spoke it that her name, Linder, was kinda tricky to keep in his head. Gregorio burst out praising Ulthus' greeting as splendid, but inside, Ulthus shrugged it off. He figured it was just ordinary. Gregorio kept praising Ulthus, raving that a child this wise could only lead to a peaceful future, and Ulthus just gave a quiet, simple thank you, while Gregorio's eye-patched companion leaned in and said, "You really can read a kid's future from how they greet you." He blinked and there they were, a tight circle of older nobles, grinning like they were impressed by him to his face, as one woman gushed over his good looks and another praised his towering presence. But Ulthus felt it instantly. The sweetness was just a disguise. This wasn't real admiration. They were already planning to turn on him the moment he was out of earshot, ready to poison the words, undermine his every move, and drain the life from his efforts. While he swallowed their fake smiles, a cold thought clawed its way into his brain. What if these people weren't just being nasty, but were tied to the Kuzd incident, maybe even the spark that started it? Moments later, Duchess Linder closed in, worry written all over her face, and asked if he was exhausted, if he wanted to hide away in a separate room to rest. He smiled politely and shook his head, telling her he was fine, then let slip that he'd be arriving soon, a quiet signal that Iris was about to show up. The moment he finished talking, a fresh figure burst into view, a man with a huge, friendly grin, arms stretched wide like he owned the moment. "Welcome," he declared, triumphant to the bone. Then the camera snapped to polished shoes, and you knew the long-awaited guest had finally arrived. Unease crashed over Ulthus as he clocked it. Gregorio had finally arrived. When he finally showed up, Gregorio didn't just greet him. He dropped to one knee and kissed Emilie's hand, a move that completely stunned Ulthus. He kept piling on compliments, praising her beauty like it never faded, and even comparing her to a butterfly twirling through a sunny field, and Emilie just nodded back, accepting every sweet word. Gregorio brushed off her thanks, telling her straight up that just getting to meet her was reward enough. Ulthus's unease kept swelling as he watched Gregorio hover too close to his mother, so he stewed inside, begging him to back off from a married woman. Right after that, Emilie spun to Ulthus and introduced Gregorio as the mayor of Ryan, and even though Ulthus already knew him from the game, he finally shook his hand and greeted him formally. He turned to Ulthus and told him straight up how much he'd grown since their last run-in, then lit up with pure excitement at finally getting to meet him properly. Even with that friendly grin and pleasant charm, Ulthus couldn't shake the uneasiness, because he knew a first impression could make or break everything. Gregorio then spilled the truth about his old ties to Ulthus' father, saying he once owed him a massive favor as a merchant's son, so now he was ready to step in, begging Ulthus to come to him anytime Ryan-related answers were needed. As night crumpled across the grand estate, Ulthus stared at Gregorio's cold, calculated move, because now he knew he had to keep playing smart or get played. Gregorio kept that unsettling grin nailed on his face and told Ulthus he'd already carved out a spot where kids his age could gather, then promised something delicious was waiting too, like, "Come on, follow me." Alfie's face snapped into focus as Gregorio's words hit him, then it all clicked and the truth finally landed. It's here. Meanwhile, Emilie shot Ulthus a cheerful wink and told him straight up, showing his face mattered because she had to juggle social duties and work, and only then did Ulthus nod respectfully and swear they'd both do their best. As Ulthus walked, he couldn't shake the thought that in normal life, showing his face would be fine, but this was an 18+ game where hidden dangers lurk and every social move is a trap. He kept moving, Gregorio's silhouette looming ahead, and one thought hit him like a spark: someday he'd see his mother again. A sudden flicker hit his thoughts, déjà vu crashing down on him like he'd already lived this moment, or maybe he'd watched it all happen, somewhere, somehow, before. Somewhere else, a young kid, caught from behind, stood in a blazing field swarming with butterflies, gripping a net like they were about to snatch every last one. Two trembling hands carefully cupped a butterfly, its wings flared wide to show off razor-sharp, intricate patterns. The ground was strewn with broken butterfly wings and tiny insect corpses, a grim warning of how brutal this place was for the innocent. A kid in a cap snapped his head up with a grin that felt wrong. His eyes went empty, cold, and soulless, like something dark was wearing his face. Alfie stared at the chilling truth sinking in. This deadly game he was trapped in felt eerily like the weird kid in the park from before he was even reincarnated, and the same sinister shadows were creeping back in. While Ulfies wrestled with his thoughts, he plowed straight down a long, sterile corridor, walking farther and farther from the man who'd just spoken to him. Just then, the smiling man slid up beside him and asked if something was wrong, cutting right through Ulfis' thoughts, yet his eyes burned with a sharp, predatory glare. Ulfis froze at the sudden appearance, then snapped himself together, acting like it was no big deal. He brushed off the worry, saying he'd just been lost in his thoughts, and the smiling man chuckled right along, buying it instantly with a knowing look. Their talk cut off, and with every step their footsteps roared ahead. Then they hit a massive, jaw-dropping room dripping with luxury. Right in front of them stood a handful of women, barely dressed, their silhouettes swallowed and revealed by a thick, creeping mist. The smiling man swept his arm and urged Ulfis to pick any woman in the room, like they were nothing more than prizes to be chosen. The room was a lavish bathhouse packed with women, some standing, some lounging, while the whole place simmered in thick steam and scandalous heat. Ulfis stammered out a shaky objection, but the smiling man bulldozed over him, saying he didn't have to fake anything, and then he dropped Gregorio's name, implying Ulfis already knew the drill, and Ulfis felt himself reel inside. He kept going, saying the world only has two kinds of people, the special ones and everyone else, and then he slammed the point home. Ulfis was one of the special ones for real. The smiling man leaned in and whispered that special people could do whatever they wanted to everyone else, and Ulfis flinched, because that casual cruelty screamed indoctrination, and he knew the guy was trying to twist his mind with that sick ideology. He suddenly found himself in a nightmare, masked hostesses in barely their outfits all around, and unease crashed down on him as he blurted, "I'm in trouble." His thoughts kept racing, painting a brutal future. One slip into Gregorio's honey trap would mean brainwashing, manipulation, and a slow slide into becoming the very despicable villain he feared most, so he vowed with full force to dodge that path at all costs. He kept wrestling with what his choices really meant, only to realize the sisters in front of him weren't the prize at all, and that his own pick had already been locked in long before he ever decided. In front of him, 5 masked hostesses lined up in shimmering lingerie, all smiling like they already knew exactly how to pull him in. His thoughts were yanked to a halt by a gut-punch realization, eyes snapping wide, sweat popping on his brow as he blurted out, "Which one, Rira?"